I problematize austerity. Austerity has actually, of course, informed our societies and how we think about our society. And austerity has been so widespread in its uptake over the last century that it has actually become largely undetectable. It's rarely called by its name. However, it really underscores all the common tropes of contemporary politics. So we can think about budget cuts, especially in welfare expenditures, right? So public education, healthcare, housing, unemployment benefits, regressive taxation. We see a lot of that everywhere. Deflation. We see right now that what the IMF is doing about the interest rates. Privatization, wage repression, employment deregulation. A set of policies that we're very familiar with, and for this reason, I think we rarely really problematize at their very core. So I tried to develop in this book a novel lens on austerity. And why is it novel? I think for three main reasons. The first is that I tried to think about austerity not just about fiscal policy. So it's usually just understood as budget cuts. I try to make a case that austerity is actually a trinity. So it's also monetary and industrial. And when I talk about industrial austerity, I talk about actually direct attacks on organized labor, wage repression. And I show in the book how these three forms of austerity mutually reinforce one another. Okay, so it's very, I think, reductive to only think about fiscal austerity as what actually informs our society today. And more than this, it's not just a trinity, it's also both policy and theory. So of course, austerity policies have succeeded through times and being constantly implemented because it has a very powerful economic theory backing it. So we need to look at the amalgamation and again, the mutual reinforcement between these policies and these theories. So this is the first point. Second point is that austerity is not the product of this so-called neoliberal era starting from the 70s. Austerity is actually a mainstay of modern capitalism, and with very few years of exception, it has really kind of informed what capitalism is. Third claim that I tried to make is that austerity is not madness, as kind of Mark Blythe puts it. It's not just a matter of wrong economic policy stemming from incorrect theory. This Keynesian interpretation of austerity is highly reductive because it misses the central point, which is that austerity has a very deep goal, which is that of preserving the stability of capitalism as a socioeconomic system. So it does not preserve the stability of the economy. That's why Blythe calls it madness, because Blythe tells us, you know, it has never really worked in producing its stated goals of greater growth and paying back the debt, right? The story of expansionary austerity a la Alesina is kind of a story that we haven't really seen in practice, right? However, the point here is that I try to claim in my book that there's something much deeper. It's about stabilizing the fundamental class relation that allows for economic growth to even take place under capitalism. So that's the title of the book. It's a weird title, right? The capital order. What do I mean by the capital order? Capital order, capital not just as a thing, as money, as commodities, but the fact that money and commodities presuppose the fundamental social relation by which the majority of us has to sell its labor power on the market in order to survive, okay? So the preservation of the indisputability of class relations and private property of the means of production as the main function of austerity in the capitalist world. So I just want to read a brief quote, and I wrote this. what's clear is that austerity is particularly effective, not in stabilizing economies, but in stabilizing class relations. After all, austerity has historically never been about curbing inflation and budget control. Its manipulations of aggregate demand have always been a means to a deeper end. Austerity secured the best possible conditions for profits to soar, while the majority, the politically undeserved, were forced to relinquish all fledgling projects of economic democracy and to live harder, through lower wages and lower consumption. Austere capitalism produces losers and winners, and it always has, okay? So that's kind of the main thesis of the book. Now, how do I argue for this thesis? Well, I think the point is that in its modern form, austerity cannot be divorced from the historical context in which it actually was born. And I look at the period of the most crushing and devastating crisis of capitalism still to this day, which is the famous Red Biennium that occurred after the First World War, right? From 1918 to 1920, there was a huge mobilization of the working classes, not just demanding higher wages, but demanding completely different social relations of production. So it was really, there were calls for economic democracy, and of course, the Workers' Council movement I explore in the first part of the book. So step back. The book is divided in two parts. The first part is about the crisis of capitalism that emerged after the First World War. The second part is about the reaction, austerity as a powerful tool to react and restabilize the capital order. That's the structure. So in the first part of the book, I'm just going to say a couple of things for both and then I stop, yeah? In the first part of the book, fundamentally, the idea is that the Great War completely shook the so-called natural boundaries between the market and the state. The state had to intervene like never before in the sphere of the economic to actually produce a victorious possibility of producing enough to win the war. So the war emergency basically shook the immovability of the market. And this produced a sense by the working classes of fundamental denaturalization of the pillars of capitalism. So there was a sense, and this is not me saying it, I did a lot of work on, for example, looking at all the material of the war cabinet committees that were actually interviewing workers because, of course, of the big industrial unrest. And they say very clearly, they wanted a new social order that presupposed actually a completely different role for the workers in the society. So the state intervention basically triggered a crisis that was quite existential because people were not accepting society as it had stood until that moment. They were demanding something different. And so the first part of the book looks at the Workers' Council movements as the most extreme radical fight both against the state and against capital. But then I also look at other forms of transformations that are more reformist, from the Sankey Committee about the nationalization of coal, the Guild Socialist movement, and even just the enlightened bureaucrats that were also kind of convinced that capitalism as we had seen it until that moment, was not really working to maintain social stability fundamentally. Second part of the book shows how economists were very reactive in trying to stop what was happening. And what I do is that I start the narrative by looking at two fundamental, the first international financial conferences in Brussels of 1919 and at Genoa. No, Brussels 1920, sorry. I never know the dates of the conference that I myself studied. It's 1919 and Genoa a couple of years later. And what I show there is that basically austerity emerges combined with technocracy. So the rule of experts emerges, really kind of economic professors are for the first time called to advise policymaking. So that's the start of the story. And then I show how this austerity code that was kind of thought about at Genoa with all these experts and state bureaucrats was then implemented in many different countries. And I focus on Britain and Italy. And why do I do this? And this is why we also have Vicky here with us, is that they, of course, were representative of extremely different social institutional settings. So we have a parliamentary democracy, the cradle of capitalism, and the, an empire that is losing its hegemony to the United States on the one end, and on the other end we have a newborn dictatorship and the emergence of fascism. So what I show is that in both cases, austerity operates very, very similarly, and not just similarly in terms of policy, so in terms of really kind of curtailing the bargaining power and the voice of the workers. And I show how that happens through these coercive policies, but also similarly in terms of economic theories, and fundamentally in terms of austerity of ideology that shows that liberalism and fascism, when it comes to protecting capitalism, are not separate after all. They kind of unite. So economic professors like Luigi Einaudi, right, who is like he became our president of the Republic after the fall of Mussolini, who everyone thinks is a great anti-fascist. If you look at the 1920s, when really capitalism was being challenged, he was siding with his colleagues who are explicitly fascist, including the Minister of Finance, Alberto De Stefani. And fundamentally, the whole liberal elite in Italy in those years was convinced that Mussolini was the right man at the right time to prevent the collapse of the capital order. And Mussolini was a great student of austerity, and this allowed him, and this is the last thing I say, allowed him to fundamentally gain the legitimacy, which is also international. So he was praised on The Economist, on The Times. The establishment, the liberal establishment all over the world was actually looking with very pleased eyes at what Mussolini was doing, to the point that they were really willing to say, okay, it doesn't really matter if he's murdering and killing and jailing people. What really matters right now is that Italy would be much worse off if we had left it in the hands of this irrational masses who were calling for a different order of things. And the last chapter just tries to show how this is a pattern that repeats itself to this day, fundamentally. But how kind of the logic of austerity is really fully understood in this moment in which it was very explicit what austerity was meant to do. Now it's less explicit, so we have hard time seeing what are really kind of the enduring results of keeping us kind of consenting to the system we're in. Thank you.
Professor Phillips-Fein, I think it's up to you. Yes.
Lovely. Thank you so much. And thank you again. Thank you for inviting me in the first place. And thank you for, I feel as though I am sort of there and yet not there and yet there at the same time in that strange Zoomy way. But thank you for inviting me to participate today and for letting me read the book, the whole book, which I know that the workshop read just 3 of the chapters. So I greatly enjoyed the book. Many congratulations on its completion and imminent publication. And I think it will raise a lot of questions for people, and that it will prompt a lot of discussion. So it's my hope that my comments today will help to launch what will be a long period for you of talking about the book. So the Capital Order makes a number of very important arguments, I think, both about the nature of austerity politics, about fascism and its relationships to neoliberalism, about economic knowledge and politics, and about the period between World War I and the Great Depression. And it's a very rich book, drawing both on archival work, on intellectual history, and also you mentioned briefly, but I think you might highlight even more the economic analysis that you do near the end of the book, to suggest that austerity has not been fully understood, and that its lineage as a distinct set of policies and an orientation towards the economy extends back really to this moment after World War I, which you sketch as full of radical possibility and uncertainty about the future, and highlighting that sense of contingency around that moment. And beyond that, the book argues that austerity, by which, as you said in your opening remarks, you mean more than just the simple set of policies around privatization, around cutting public programs and welfare benefits, that it really reflects a full-fledged class politics, that it's an effort in a way to settle a crisis, whether political or economic, by insisting on the primacy of market relationships and weakening people's claim on social resources. One of the most interesting aspects of the book for me is the reconstruction that you provide of the thinking of the economists that you focus on, especially the British and Italian economists, and the close parallel that we find between the comments then and ideas prevalent today. I love the discussion of the ways that the excessive consumption of alcohol and sweets by Italian workers after World War I is placing this intense burden on the Italian economy and has to be curbed. The passages about this strong moral sense about individual consumption and how it's mirrored in anxiety about public budgets. This is very striking, and it's very resonant of the framework of the welfare queen or other tropes that are quite familiar today of even in American politics, the idea of Social Security benefits being too high, and that this is people's sense of comfort is closely linked to an impending fiscal crisis. And yet at the same time, I think there's something about that similarity that raises questions for me instead of fully answering them. And I think one of the underlying questions I had reading the book is, what is austerity ultimately? And can we think of it operating in this kind of very broad historical framework, manifesting itself at different points according to the same basic logic? In a way, the book raised the question for me, is austerity in 1921, is it really the same as in 1975 or again in politics today? So I wanted to raise three more specific questions about the book, or things to hear you talk about, but which are ultimately also maybe really questions about methodology and discipline and the relationship between economics and history. And I think my first question was about the politics of war and the immediate post-war period. The immediate post-war depression in the US has actually received some recent attention from the American right, or from American conservatives who have cited this period, actually, the sharp recession after the war, as a road not taken after 1929, suggesting that it might have been, that since, at least in the conservative take, that since the American economy bounced back after 1920, following a round of tax cuts and the breaking of unions that had grown in membership during the war, the idea being that this framework could maybe have been used after 1929 as well, and that the New Deal, which in their vision prolonged depression, was a mistake. So I was especially interested, having encountered some of these arguments recently, to see the emphasis on that moment here. And I was very struck by the vision of World War I as a moment that strengthens the left and out of which the left emerges on the march. And I was persuaded by your suggestion that the ways that the war really shook the existing order and that it undermined faith in laissez-faire capitalism, not just because of the experience of state control during the war, but because in a way the war itself was such a disaster and laissez-faire capitalism had been unable to stop or prevent it or offer an alternative. And then of course the Bolshevik Revolution transformed world politics and made revolution seem possible and tangible in a different way. And I think the evocation of the political uncertainties of this moment was one of the most interesting parts of the book for me. And this may, I think as an Italian historian, and it's the emphasis on the red years is one part of that, but I also love the passages, for example, on the British feminist movement's imagination of what might be possible at the end of the war. But at the same time, I wanted to hear a little bit more about the ways that the war might have strengthened the right at the same, in the book as well, and how war and nationalism more generally reshaped the political landscape. In Britain and also in the US, the war was in many ways a real setback for the left. And even the strike wave that follows the war, while it is dramatic, I think it's partly an expression of a kind of political weakness rather than strength. And that's part of why it's so thoroughly beaten and the unions are reduced so greatly in their power. So I wondered a little bit about this and whether the reaction, therefore, is possible to sum up as austerity per se, and why is austerity needed, given that in many ways the left is in retreat? And if we, so I think that was one set of questions that I had, and I think you may think that it's, yeah, maybe it's you rejected the left being in retreat, but how to think about the conflicting politics that emerge out of the war. Mm-hmm. Second, I was actually curious to hear a little bit more about the distinctive role of finance and financial discipline and the banks in creating the pressure for more specific policies in addition to the broader frame of austerity. You have a great section on J.P. Morgan and its financing of the Bank of Italy in the 1920s, really very new. I really didn't know anything about that material. And especially its interest in guaranteeing that Italian monetary policy would be set without popular pressure. And also very interesting is the tacit support for fascism among the US press and financiers as a way of calming Italian politics. But I wanted actually to hear more about how you thought about these financial imperatives and especially their relationship to the economists. And here, this came partly out of my own sense of my work on 1970s New York and on urban fiscal crises, because I saw certain real parallels between that moment and what you're describing, of course. There is this wave of social unrest and upheaval in the late 60s and early 70s in American cities, met with increasing resistance that ultimately finds, you could say, its expression in fiscal crisis, and then the subsequent retrenchment, which if the cities are different, that retrenchment doesn't last, I think, forever, but it does stymie many of the demands for deeper reforms and for real change that had been present previously. But one of the really interesting parts of that period, at least for me, was that in a lot of ways, economic theory itself did not, I think, play a central role in a lot of these conflicts. There's a very strong sense of people acting under intense pressure from financial institutions, but in a way it is not theorized, and the theoretical iterations of it come later. So there's a way in which the actors in the story are really, I want to hear more from you about the specific weight of financial crisis. If you saw that, it flickers up and down in your story, but I was just interested to hear more about it. And then finally, one last point, I was curious to hear you speak a little bit more about the connections between fascism and liberalism. And I suspect that this association will be one of the questions people have about the book. Was the Italian experience of fascism one of austerity? And what do you make of the public investments of the regime afterward? It is, and I know there are different periods, but how to think about what that means and what it means in the framework of austerity. I think and then beyond that, I think you are right to pinpoint the deep skepticism about democracy when it involves public spending and economic life that hovers underneath liberal politics and economics. I mean, there are ways in which here we see liberalism reach around and into a much more repressive politics. And I find the resonance you point to quite powerful, but I think I would be curious to hear you elaborate that point further. And then finally, I guess this leaves the frame of the book somewhat, but I think you probably as you talk about the book, you will find a lot of people having this. I'd just be interested to hear you speak more about alternatives to austerity. And this is asked partly, this is perennially, I'm asked this about New York, what could have been different? And I think it's often hard that you say, well, if everything would have to be different for things to be different. I don't think that borrowing, and especially at least just in the much more narrow case, New York and the fiscal crisis, that type of borrowing, which relied on shaky accounting and a deep lack of transparency, that isn't really the answer. But then what is the solution, especially given the solution may be broadening our political horizons and sense of possibility. But that, of course, isn't something that one can just will into existence either. So how do you think about that and alternatives to austerity? So I think I'll wrap up there, and hopefully that wasn't too long. So
Thank you so much.
This was awesome. Thank you so much. Really fantastic.
Professor de Grazia, please.
Thank you, thank you. So you've heard the title, let me just repeat it. The Capital Order, How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way to Fascism. Now, the key word ends up being austerity in the title, but insofar as Clara is deeply engaged with defining this austerity trinity, the politics of austerity in a rigorous way. But the ultimate aim here is how government, or maybe one would almost want to say governmentality, because that's something broader than government, because we're talking about these economists and some figures larger and larger, how this governmentality reinstated order under the capitalist system of social relations. So as she will repeat in the book, that the ultimate interest is how capitalist control over classes was reinstated. Now, she very ably tacks in several different ways to, let's say, make port in this storm, because she wants to convince us of the unitary nature of this economic project, of its importance, and of the political and economic, as well as the intellectual, insofar as sort of mystification on the part of economists, and also moral danger. And I want to come back to this question of moral dangers. Okay. It's very interesting then as a project, because she is in ways working as an historian as well as an economist here. That is, it's rooted in events. Okay, in that sense, it's historical. It's also interested, I won't say so much in genealogy, no, but rather in lineage, which you could date back, let's say, from 2012, and the kind of events which she and others of you actually saw going on globally, maybe, but certainly in the European area, and then back to probably time that predates your birth, maybe, but the 1970s, which is our moment, not only in the United States, but if you read Raymond Barre, or you read poor Wilson caught out by the IMF, or Margaret Thatcher with her, there's no other way, and 98, I'm going to say this is very resonant. Now, let me be a little bit clearer here. So this idea is there's a capital order that wants to restore class relations. Clara is very emphatic on the economic trinity, knock down the wages, restore fiscal control. She's very good on the social relations, very good on the political relations. What's something more obscure is the moral dimension. And I want to emphasize that, first of all, because I think deeply in the notion of austerity is that kind of weird doubleness that we sometimes get in Western, maybe Judeo-Christian political economy. It's a little like the word consumption, which first means wasting away, and then turns over to becomes a word notion of thriving and giving and getting. And austerity has that quality to it. For example, just to give 1647, here's a moral meaning. Somebody named T. Hodges, that which either by too much excess and riotous courses ruins nature, or else on the contrary, by too much austerity and self-elected rigidity, sink in time the body and bring it the dust of death. And then the second example is from 1923, the New York Times, June 15th. Members of the fascisti are prohibited from participating in banquets because, quote, banquets are detrimental to the dignity of the fascismo, which must be inspired by austerity. So there is a notion here clearly of a capital order that is pushing back, right, economically, which is going to bring in political means, social means, but behind it, there is also some notion of moral order, which gives legitimacy both to the capital order, which is pushing back, and also delegitimizes the appetite, the needs, the wants of this working class, which only has a right to certain right created by the market fictitiously to have a certain level of wages in order to purchase some questions. Now, this is a question probably I kind of became more familiar with, having worked on consumption coming out of the 1970s, when so much emphasis was put on the workplace and the wage and work, when the question had come up in the United States with Fordism. I think of Larry Glickman's excellent work, which was showing really the wage has to do with the consumption, and that those two things have to be balanced out. And the great American way, Keynes in Europe, is to sort of work your way out of that impasse and say higher wages are deserved, well earned, and so on and so forth, because there's a certain level of consumption which is necessary to sustain the worker, but also then to sustain the capitalist order. Okay, so the austerity then, somehow, how do we figure that in, that you would get that kind of pushback against a model which in some ways had already been understood in the United States and was drifting on to Europe, with the Beto system and others, that you could get piecework or something to actually raise wages, and that could be legitimate insofar it would have all sorts of integrating moral effects, lifting the standard of living and making moralizing, if you want, the workers in that capitalist order. So it's certainly a concept of capital order which ranges in a different way, and that's, I think, was what's so disturbing about the 2012 moment, God knows, the 1975 moment. Just for a pause here, in terms, you think of Greece, you say, my God, are they going to go back to having bad teeth and looking not like Europeans? I mean, the idea of the capital order going back 40, 50 years, where people were physiologically different, whether they came out of one class or another, or that 1975, I happened to be fired from the City University. I should say laid off, which was fine. But I was as shocked, certainly, to see an enormous pile of reels of film, because they had disbanded the film department at Lehman College, and they'd thrown all this stuff as garbage into the street, something that we loved so much in the 60s and 70s as film, and there it was all over the place. Anyway, the point here is that maybe if we can work in that question of the moral order and how that actually plays a part. So then the question, we don't have to call these economists with all of their fictions hypocrites. Okay, that seems to be, or to say that it's ideologically justified, rather to build it in as part of the structure.
Yes.
Now, this book, of course, obviously interests me because of my own interest in Italy, and looking back at work that was done in the 70s. I mean, think of Charles Mayer's book, the premise of recasting bourgeois Europe. He even uses the term, but not in the way you do, all over. It appears austerity here, austerity, and then you go on to corporatism. So it makes a big leap, really, beyond the 26, the stabilization, to the new order. And likewise, a man named Douglas Forsyth, whom you use very effectively, working on Italy, but in that intermediary moment, trying to get at Professor Fein's point, that is what would have been the alternative, this man Nitti. But that, very nice liberal guy, Democrat, and he has to make the first cut subsidies. Those more subsidies for wheat flour, which gets rid of one of those nice bonuses people had, which was probably getting white flour from the United States during the war. Coming to this though, so what have we done here? It's an extraordinarily well-structured argument really goes through. Now that I hear you, I'm reminded, I haven't heard you speak in a while. It's your voice, that's for sure. And it takes, I think, a prehistory key that the wartime exposes the state. If you think on one side, the capitalist side, hegemony is born in the factory. Well, there it is. If you're on the worker side, hegemony is born in the factory. They're investing huge amounts for productivity, not just for the war, but for the post-war. The Italian state periodically gets this bug about development and does that. Very important. So that wartime is key here, that everything changes. And pointed out the new goods, and probably working class, working women buying stuff, trinkets, gloves, hats, because they have to go back and forth on the buses. So there's a lot of new commerce and new, in broader sense, which is very important. The war really is an extraordinary and great, so, and ditto that period of the EU frolic, with the Euro, and the 1960s, 70s, where expansion, New York City is on a roll, doing things that others in the United States aren't doing. Okay. The post-war then, this working class, all right, takes very seriously the New Order, Gramsci, and so on. We'll come back to that. And this reformist alternative, which is not very clear, we might come back to really what was the alternative here, because that seems to be Tina. There's no other alternative of Margaret Thatcher. Coming back to Tina, and then we have to goes to two post-war, these two international meetings, Brussels and Genoa. I see more of the Brussels. I saw less the Genoa, but there is an international thinking. You got to push back. And it is generalized, probably find it in Japan, but hey, that's not your problem, this, okay? Then this action, and then comparison. Action in Great Britain, action in Italy. Very nice, sort of these comparisons. And then very neat, the views of GB, that is, I'm sorry, my Great Britain on Italy, and especially the British delight in Mussolini, who comes across as kind of a fascist grad grind here. Very important figure. He's doing everything the British do, but much better because he's using cudgels. And those Italians do. Italian character, it's the administration best suited to the character of the Italian people, not the British who love their liberty. And so there's this delight in this financial but actually say something more there. It's actually a very important part of a British order in which they're helping the US. They're acting on the continent for the disquiet peoples, the fluttery folks like the Yugoslavs and others who don't take seriously capitalist order. And the Italians are, Poles also have that problem. All these types who don't quite know how to get people in order. All right. So British does stand here as both the ideologue as well as the financier, and that's important. Now, questions. Clearly, I could hear on the resonance of Polanyi. Gramsci, very interesting insofar as Gramsci's idea of a hegemony that comes out of the factory in this case. And so there are strong ideological elements, which still I don't think you actually conceptualize very clearly. Those figures are, and then studies of fascism. Okay, studies of fascism separately. So the Polanyi, the Gramsci, but then the studies of fascism, which are trying to place this on a spectrum, fascism on a spectrum, where you could have a liberal reaction, Britain, and an American one, but it sort of depends on the level of coercion, how much coercion you need. And you can go from the United States, which deports tens of thousands of people, and break in, you call out the Pinkerton guards or whatever. And then you get Italy, which uses this and that. It's probably exaggerate the numbers killed. It's probably like four or 500, but that's enough in Italy. You don't need to kill a lot of people in Italy to get, just a different system. Okay, questions. Why use the term technocrats? I know you want to hit Monty and Draghi and all, the bums around the internet, the World Bank and so like that. But actually, these are quite interesting figures. They may be coming out of the university, but they're very engaged. Pantaleone's heavily involved in already politics. Gide, not Andre, Andrew Gide, what's his first name? Andrew Gide's uncle. And then Charles is he's the founder of the cooperative movement in France, and then globally, he's an active. Pigou is already, these are figures, I don't think you do justice calling them technocrats. I think that they actually, again, the moral ideological sway is wider. Technocrat is Monty, Draghi, this kind of bloodless EU bureaucratic, because that's their model. These are people who are much more, closer to Keynes. I mean, they're already becoming sort of almost public intellect. Anyway, do something with that. I think technocrats is not a useful term here in any way. These are bigger. Okay, so I'm not even asking a question there. But it's related to the other thing, why you use the word occasionally hypocrisy. And again, I think the question is about moral order, which you would. So, all right, so then I have three questions then. How important is, what's the stakes in saying that there was a full-fledged revolution going on in the factories? Why can't you have a half-baked revolution going on and nonetheless the belief that there's a revolution going on? And so a pushback, which is out and out counter-revolution. You don't have to have a revolution to have a counter-revolution. That's okay. Second, the question that you make very, very well, which is really why the last chapter is second to last chapter, how Britain views Italy, that the capital order is workers back, that trinity, organizations destroyed, new organizations set up, the gold standard, and Italy being in a kind of quasi-colonial role. So it's a hierarchy, you keep saying. The class hierarchy is also a global hierarchy. And I think you make that point actually very well, it's there. But it could have been part of your hierarchy, but I think that's there. That's actually very, very strong in the book, very strong. So it was a question now, this is not, did this happen elsewhere? Canada? I mean, in other words, was there a kind of reordering that's going on that you could make it the whole turn to the gold standard is part of an austerity politics? Maybe it's a question that we could write other things on. Okay, funny, now this again this is to think beyond. So I was wondering, this austerity on wages, and thinking of the present and also the 70s, the opposite face of it, or the specular face, is all the intervention on the bodies. So Foucault, you have austerity on the one hand, on the wage side, and then everybody's micro-powering bodies. And ditto 2012 is sort of the Greece, are they going to fall out? What's going to happen? Then COVID interferes, but certainly in Italy, the more the wage is reduced, the more they start to intervene in welfare and other aspects too, because the problem is of their capital. And if you don't pay them a wage, you still want them to reproduce. You still want them to be handsome. To be your people as well as your population. So it's a kind of a question, if you take the austerity on the wage and order front, whether there's another kind of intervention that's going on, because the capital order is not only based in the factory, and especially in a country like Italy. Britain has 60% that are salaried. Italy had 23%, 27%. It's amazing how small numbers of the people are actually salaried. It's a big agenda, but hey, you can handle it.
Great. I mean, thank you so much, really. I'm also going to keep it super brief because maybe, or should we?
You can respond first and then we can.
I have a lot to respond to, so I need to be super, okay, I'll just say small things. But anyway, first thing I want to say is that I feel super honored. These were amazing. I mean, thank you. This was a wonderful, wonderful response. So I'm really, really grateful. For these wonderful comments. Okay, so let's see, let's go to Kimberly's points. So maybe let's touch maybe first on the moral question. because it's the one that is most is closest to the moral question. That is very important in the sense that definitely what I try to explain is that, and the reason why I use technocracy, so I'll defend maybe that point too, is that it is in that historical moment that, of course, I'm a historian of economic thought, so part of my interest is also to see the development of the discipline. And it's in that moment with the marginalist revolution has happened 10, 20 years back, but it's really settling in terms of also its dominance in academia in those years. And part of the pure economics, right? They call it pure economics. Why do they call it pure economics? Because the very idea there is that it is gaining the status of a hard science, objectivity, classless point of view, neutrality. So of course, this is what in a way is the powerful justification for austerity is you guys have to sacrifice, you have to consume less and produce more. And this refrain of consuming less and producing more is constantly present, but you're doing this because we know what's best for you, and we have the truth in our hands, the correct economic theory that tells you that only if these are the conditions will we actually, prosper. They never used the term economic growth because it wasn't really a term used yet, but that was basically the idea. We will get back to the fundamentals that will benefit everyone. So it's interesting there because, of course, this apolitical nature of technocracy, which I stress a lot also in the Italian chapter, clashes immediately, not only with the clear, what I write is the most classist thing you can do is come up with a theory that presupposes it's being neutral and objective to impose class hierarchies, right? So it's a great trick, and it's the trick that we still see now, and it's what makes economists so important in advising policymaking. So I think it's interesting here because you really see that what they think about themselves as being, and I agree, it's not hypocritical. That's a word that my editor wanted to insert here and there, but I agree with you because they fully are convinced of the truth of their doctrine, right? This is the real power of ideology. They are convinced that the work they're doing is the good of the people, but for them, the good of the people is the sacrifice. And this is informed by the theory, but at the same time, of course, in their very doings, the political nature necessarily emerges. The political nature of their apolitical theory necessarily emerges, right? And with it also kind of the moral aspect of it is the one that makes it more obvious. Einaudi calls himself the apostle of the verb of abstinence, sacrifice. So I actually give the titles of the op-eds he was writing at the time. He's really about sacrifice, abstinence. It is very moral, right? But it's very moral. But if you then look at their theory, it becomes all of a sudden very kind of sterile. But that's why I claim in my book that you need to have both their theoretical works and their actual engaged work, and more like militant political contributions also on the press. You can't just look at these economists. This is a problem with economics, with the historians of economic thought. They only focus on the theory of the authors as completely abstracted from the author's own kind of participation. As you were saying, the reason why you were disputing the idea that they're technocrats was that they were involved more broadly in political questions. So if you put the two pieces together instead of just compartmentalizing like a lot of scholarship does, then you really see what is the problem with this technocratic agenda of having a pure theory that is actually going to tell everyone else what is best for society. And I think the moral aspects that emerge more in their kind of press article is what helps reveal it. And then of course, the other thing that reveals it very clearly is the type of policies they're advocating for and the results of these policies, right? So that's a comment I wanted to make. I'm gonna pick one second. About central bank, I think that was the question that Kimberly was probably most interested in, is because it relates to your work.
Actually, Kim was most interested in the question of the alternative government. What else? Because you do, sorry to interfere on that, but I think that was.
So right, and that's also like a point that you're pointing out.
Austerity calls, because you
Right.
get back. Into
Okay,
the system
yeah,
and so on. So what is there such a thing as a liberal austerity, or do you have to go whole hog to crack heads and get everybody back?
I thought the idea that there was the alternative to austerity. You're saying like different
you
spectrums.
spend time in the book itself that suggests that there was, a kind of another way. It sounded like you were referring to Nietzsche. That at a certain point there's some notion of how you could get out of this dilemma, how you could go back to so-called normal after the war. A new normal. I don't. Again, I'm not sure what that.
Well, so I think the point here is that, in that historical moment, it seems like that austerity was really the way forward, because what I tried to explain in chapter 2 is actually that there was a lot of attempts from the part of state leaders and bureaucrats to actually go the reformist way, right? Try to appease the population through measures that were proto-Keynesians fundamentally, right? So proto-Keynesian measures to appease the population, and very sophisticated, as Kimberly was pointing out, very sophisticated agendas, especially in Britain, with the Minister of Reconstruction having all these committees that were really building a world that would have been amazing if it had happen. So what I show there, though, is that ultimately, what I say is that these reforms are kind of non-reformist in the results, in the sense that they tend to frustrate still the demand of the workers and kind of thus escalate further social tensions. And at the same time, of course, and going back to, I think, a very important point that Kimberly was pointing out, what about the right? What about the role of the right? So that was your point also. And I think theirs is that these reformists get a double attack. The workers are pissed off and there's a lot of actual council movements and calls for abolition of the capitalist state altogether, okay? But then there's also, of course, the right that emerges and is equally terrified by this break from the laissez-faire order. So it was kind of a non-way out of it, because it wasn't satisfying either poles that were actually emerging very strongly with the First World War. And I agree with you, Kimberly, that the point here is that I wanted to stress that, of course, I tried to look at more about the alternatives that were emerging in terms of, I tried to delineate many practices of different degree of radicality of the alternatives to the current order. But it's also the case that with the war, the state is experimenting on the most authoritarian measures, right? For example, direct repression of the workers, the militarization of the workforce, royal decree laws that didn't have to go through parliament. Especially in Italy, there was a huge restructuring of the state as very authoritarian, even pre-Mussolini, because that was needed to take quick action, right? You didn't have time for parliamentary discussion. You wanted to act immediately. So I agree that these are forms that, of course, while the radical left was emerging in Italy, the radical right was emerging in Italy as well, in various forms, right? From the squadraccio fascista to actually experiments of how to utilize the state, wield state power to crush. So certainly, so that's why I think at that point I should have stressed probably more in the book, like what does war politics mean from the point of view of the right emerging, which clearly set the stage for this austere counterattack. So I think the moderate alternatives, this is what I would like to now explore, kind of a very, I guess, ambitious thesis could be Keynesianism was possible only in a moment in which class conflict had already been tamed by what happened in the 1920s. So when Keynesianism, and I'm now actually studying the post-Second World War moment, and we need to really see what Keynesianism actually meant, because actually Keynesianism was never really I think there's a big idealization of what Keynesianism was after the Second World War, but certainly this larger possibility of having workers consume a little bit more was possible because I think there was like the real revolutionary attempts had already been tamed. And to consider that Keynes is like a minor character in my book, but it's very important to stress that in the years that I focus on, 1919, 1920, 1921 in Britain, Keynes was the biggest supporter of austerity of all. He changes his mind once the general strike is basically already done, once fundamentally the civilization, the bourgeois civilization that he thinks is the only civilization possible has been kind of stabilized, right? That's when then he thinks about the possibilities of actually, you know, having a more humane capitalism, like the progressives in the United States were thinking about, right? But when it is about really like, he fears inflation like crazy, and he fears it because he's seeing. So again, there, I think that this whole discussion, and this is what I write in the foreword at the end of the book, also helps a little bit rethink about these supposed like reformist capitalism that we kind of idealize as the correct norm. And then there's all these deviations, but actually it has never really been the norm. And if you look at it, ultimately it's still a very reactionary attempt to appease the population. And in some moments is more feasible than others. But in terms of economic theory, this is what I also discuss, is that when is the theory becoming kind of reactionary? When, instead of having a labor theory of value and having the worker as central agent, you move to a model in which the entrepreneur is the central agent. When you abolish the idea of class conflict and antagonism and you move to a model that is all about harmony and individual success. This is the same things that Keynes retains in his model, right? So of course he rebukes Say's law. There is a little bit of change in his theory, but fundamentally the core of what was the theory justifying austerity is kind of present, to the point that of course you can do full employment until it clashes with inflation. And then you're gonna go, no, I'm sorry, we were just kidding. Let's cut back on the expenditures. Okay, there was too much. I hope we can. Last thing I want to say is the thing, of course, fascism. And actually, I was thinking that Vicky would also bring this up. We normally understand fascism as corporatist, right? As statist in the full sense of actually state intervention in big public expenditures, as Kimberly was pointing out, right? So here, the whole point for me is to actually reassess also what we understand as fascism, because the corporatism was, again, I think, never lost its austere core. That was really kind of what made fascism successful at the beginning. If you look at corporatism is still about safeguarding private property as the priority. If you look at the labor charter of 1927 and all of like the founding documents of realized corporatism, if you like, austerity is never let go of. So then, of course, there's moments in which you need more state spending. But I think the problem with a lot of historians of fascism is that they tend to like really misregard. There's basically nothing on this first period. There's a famous book of Toniolo, but again, I don't think it's enough stressed how much austerity informs the corporatist phase. So I tried to develop that, but now I have no time. And I'm sorry, I spoke too much. And there were too many wonderful questions. Can I have maybe some reactions for the audience? And
perfect. Gotham and then Mark.
So I just want to ask one broad question with a couple of things under it. And the broad question is like, what differences your comparison reveals between the effects of austerity projects in very different kinds of societies, in the sense that, and I basically have two ways to unfold that. I mean, the first one is that I wondered what you make of, I wonder whether in the rest of the book you pursue an argument about different class fractions, because while I completely agree that the big question here is the labor-capital relationship, if we followed someone like Geoffrey Ingham, on Britain, the argument would be that the central thing for Britain in this period is this kind of nexus of treasury, banking, and the city. And the the austerity project is fundamentally related to preserving London as the kind of financial and commercial centre, and so preserving the strong pound is central to that. And it's not necessarily about industrial capitalism or austerity, but rather finance capitalists. So I wondered where the place of different class fractions and maybe different kinds of interests related to austerity is in the argument. And then secondly, I guess, the contrast again between Britain and Italy, perhaps. What are the different effects of austerity in a society that has to reign in a massive sort of upsurge of the red years, but also is one that is aiming to produce industrialization and predominantly still agrarian society? Do you think there's a comparison, or I'd be interested to know what the different effects are? I work in an agrarian society or austerity is introduced, so I wonder.
So Clara, do you want to take a Mo's question and then you can respond to both?
Yes. So sorry, just to see if I understood the second point, because you were saying Italy was also quite agrarian, but you're saying what would it be the effect on more of an agrarian country?
No. What's the Britain-Italy comparison?
Right.
So the different effects of austerity in an industrialized to a still predominantly agrarian society.
Right. Okay. Maybe yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, actually along similar lines, two questions. The first is really about the analytical scope. This is the issue that Professor Fein brought up. What is really the subject matter? What are we trying to give a theory of? Because it's clearly not, it doesn't seem to be, as it initially suggested, everything for people pull austerity. So we're not attempting to give a theory of the Baltics from 2009 to 2011, although the Italian experience is mentioned, right? Really, it seems like what you're interested in is a particular kind of, repression that becomes necessary when the wage share rises too high, right? And that's not going to cover all interesting cases of austerity. It's not going to cover Jean Chrétien's Canada. Of course, it's not. It's not going to cover the Attlee government. Maybe. Well, actually, that's an interesting question. Right. So that's the first question about scope. Right. What's the subject matter? How do we relate the general particular? The second question, I think, parallels sort of Gautam's question about the class basis of austerity. I wanted to ask a question specifically about elites. Right, and the class analysis for these specifically, right? Pareto is a kind of minor player in the story about Italy, right? But there's a sort of long venerable scholarship about the so-called professional managerial class, the bureaucratic class and so on. And I was wondering whether that class had a privileged role in your understanding of the austerity project. Yeah.
Thank you. Great. So Gautam's question. So this is a typical, I think it's another typical, right? If you read the literature on the Treasury, so I started all this research because I was, I read George Pedon's book on the Treasury. He was really he is still basically the expert on the British Treasury. And when you read George Pedon, and then I had the luck of actually getting to know him quite well in scholarly terms, that literature is very much about the debate about the Treasury view is very much about, there's the interest of the city and the Treasury is doing the interest of the city. And then there's the interest of the industrialist class that clashes, right? So definitely there's, some elements of that story are definitely there and true. What I though try to show is somehow how if you look at the profit rate, and this is the empirical data also I have at the end, if you look at the result of the economic downturn in terms of what happens to what you're pointing out to the wage share in terms of the profit share. So I have all these graphs trying to look at wage share, profit share, and profit rates. You see that it's clearly not just the financiers that are gaining from austerity. The economic downturn, and this is kind of the idea, right? The economic downturn, I actually have a citation here, is part of the madness that someone like Blythe would call out. Why are you guys doing something that actually causes a downturn? Are you just nuts? Are you just doing the interest of the financiers who would do anything to keep the value of the sterling high? And my reasoning here is that actually, very Kalekian, if you actually economic downturns are very rational in terms of preservation of the general political order, right? So it is really the moment in which you see the shift from high wage shares to low wage shares, and you see the profit rates. It's quite impressive, the graph of the profit rate, actually, it spikes. So this is the thing. I think there's very little in those debates. It's lacking kind of the more class analysis of saying, okay, were they both elites in a way were opposing.
Could I add one thing to the question in that? So in that case, would you not still though need to mediate that point through different class fractions in order to actually get how policy is being made? Because how do capitalists, what is the knowledge of industrial capitalists as to why doing this will definitely?
Oh, no. Definitely. I know. Absolutely. That's why I'm not like doing a construction of intentions, but of actually like effects of austerity, right? Because that's what a historian I think can do, is look at the effects, not the intentions. And again, and I would like to say, of course, the role of the elite also, we know how complex history is. The point of the book is to focus on the role of the economist, which is in the title. And of course, it's kind of like, I didn't want that title, but like the publisher thought it would sell. Of course, it's like, and the economists paved the way to fascism. Of course, it's not just the economists paving the way to fascism. Fascism, like there's a huge agrarian, industrial interest and elites, moneyed people that were supporting very strong right-wing movements of all sorts. That we're supporting. So going back to all that you said after I spoke, what I tried to do though is thematize something that has been missing in the literature, which is actually the component of professional economists, academics, who certainly were not just academics, but no famous academic is just an academic. Look at Stiglitz, look at Larry Summers, look at all the people that are actually kind of the equivalents, look at Alesina, look at the equivalents of today. It's people that of course have a political presence, and you need to consider that to understand the theory and the purpose. I don't think you can see the theory as something separate from their larger worldview. That's just like a bad tendency of the historians of economic thought right now, but it's not, I think, very valid. So that's the thing, that I'm trying to focus on the role of the economists and how I think there was like a much larger ideological unity than one usually thinks about. So of course, everything you say is absolutely true. And I think there's a lot of works that try to like comes to grips. So of course, it's class analysis is necessarily kind of saying, okay, there is a larger conflict between one class and the other. But this is like just one lens into a very complex world. And I think though economists have played a role that is deeply disregarded, it's problematic because it's dangerous. Economists are dangerous. I'm an economist. It's a dangerous profession. It really is. Like, it's a problem. Like the way these people think is really the most authoritarian way possible. The models are imbued with authoritarianism. This is kind of like, it's kind of a critique of the mainstream economics as well. And this is something I think few people know about. And so that's what I was trying to point out. But then, of course, there's all the rest that is equally important.
I think we have time for maybe one more.
Yeah,
question.
sure, definitely.
Yeah, I really appreciated your talk and the responses. Fortunately, even though you invited me very late, I knew your previous articles, so I know more or less what you were talking about. And I would like to know what is your position with respect to the writings of Mikhail Kalecki. Mikhail Kalecki was an important London School of Economics Polish economist who wrote in the 50s an article that I'm sure you know, Political Aspects of Full Employment, in which he essentially argued that full employment was politically impossible because employers would ultimately lose their control of the workforce in such a setting. Mm-hmm. I would like to understand, Ben, what is your position with respect to Kalecki, and whether you think that full employment aggregate demand policies are ultimately impossible or not? Because, for example, if we focus on Italy after the Second World War, we can say that in the 60s, when full employment was essentially achieved, there was a backlash from the government and employers. But in the 70s, the bargaining power of the labor movement was so high that essentially they managed even to overturn any deflationary policy that the government was trying to enact.
Yeah, and then they enacted. Yeah.
So to what extent is Keynesianism possible, given the actions on both sides?
Yeah, that's a great question. That was it, right? That's right. This is actually what I'm trying to look at for the next book project. So you like really kind of like pointed your finger to exactly that point. Absolutely. I think I think it's a problem. It's naive Keynesianism thinks about aggregate demand management as something that can actually kind of overcome the contradictions and the limits of what capital accumulation requires in order to actually perpetuate itself, right? So I think what's interesting is in that my book, what you see is that actually Hawtrey, who is of course in conversation with Keynes himself and actually greatly informs Keynes's thinking, Ralph Hawtrey has the first ideas, actually theoretical ideas of aggregate demand management. And it's understood not in terms of increasing the purchasing power of the majority, but in the opposite term, in terms of managing their purchasing power to suppress it. So, because in that moment, of course, it was what we see today. What is the Fed doing? The whole purpose of increasing interest rates is ultimately to have an effect on the purchasing power of the majority going through fundamentally unemployment, right? It's an indirect way of preserving, again, like a kind of an industrial situation in which the majority is unemployed. And this is what's going to like deflate the economy and stabilize it and gain and achieve price stability. So it's interesting to see that actually aggregate demand management, so that's why Hawtrey is considered one of the first macroeconomists, because he's theorizing in terms of actually the effects on the purchasing power. And that's like, he talks about consumption, consumers' outlays, and that's what Keynes takes, right? So then, of course, in a moment of slump, then Keynes can use the same kind of idea in the opposite sense. But what I'm looking at now is the fact that, of course, there's limits to this, because even in the so-called golden years, there was a clear limit to how much you could actually boost aggregate consumption. So actually consume less, I don't think is actually in the motto, right? They use produce more, consume less. I don't think we've gotten like beyond the consume less limit that is still very much, but even if we think, oh no, but it's all about consumerism is so important, Keynesianism and all about like boosting aggregate demand. Yes, in very limited historical moments with very like, those moments, profit rates were very high because labor productivity was very high. It's enough to read Robert Brenner, right? The whole analysis of why was it a moment in which there was actually a possibility of having high wage share, higher consumption opportunities for the people combined with still growth and healthy capital accumulation. Because there were preconditions, including American hegemony and all that we know about. Michael Hudson's book is great, by the way, Super Imperialism, about actually the typically American conditions that allowed for that, also in terms of international relations. So that's my problem with, and that's what I would like to try to challenge in my second work, is this idea that that's the norm and the rest is like the exception, I think, has to be reversed. Actually, no, I think the exception is those supposed Keynesian years, because there were certain conditions that allowed for it. But otherwise, Kalecki is more than correct. Of course, he's in my book many times, also in the last chapter. I explicitly used his article to kind of reiterate his point. So I hope that was useful. Thank you. Thank you so much. So much. Thank you for being with us. Good. Online with us. Thank you, Kimberly.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
And I hope
I really enjoyed it.
Yeah,
yes, I'd love to actually.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, I'd love to get together actually. So let's me touch and find a time to actually meet for a coffee or a drink or something like that.
Let's do that. Fantastic. Yes.
All right. Congratulations. See you soon.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.